This video series provides a summary of the scientific findings that were presented in the first half of my book, The Hidden Truth, a logical path through compelling evidence to discover the nature of reality and the meaning of life. Each video in this series summarizes one of those chapters from the first half of my book, but the entirety of the evidence is far too expansive to fit in a short video series. So the purpose of this video series is not to present all of the evidence, but to provide you with a summary containing enough information to help you make an informed decision as to whether reading my book to learn the rest of the story would be worth your valuable time. As I've noted in my blog on WordPress, the most valuable commodity any of us possesses is time. Following our first video, which set the stage with the discussion of quantum physics, we continue now with our first examination of evidence from the medical community through a brief study of near-death experiences. Near-death experiences have been studied by doctors, psychologists, and scientists in many fields, so the topic has a wide field of respectable research from which this chapter is based. Interestingly, it does not matter about one's religion or preconceived notions of the afterlife when it comes to the characteristics one experiences with a near-death experience. These characteristics are remarkably common, regardless of one's prior conceptions about death, religion, and the afterlife. Near-death experiences are also quite common. A Gallup poll once found approximately 5% of the adult American population had experienced a near-death experience, or nearly 1 out of every 20 adults. Similar surveys in Australia and Germany suggested as high as 15% of the population might have had near-death experiences. According to the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, an estimated 774 near-death experiences occur every day in America, making near-death experiences one of the most common metaphysical experiences across the human demographic. Near-death experiences stand apart in the field of metaphysics because, if true, near-death experiences would prove that the human body has a soul that survives bodily death. People who have seemingly died from common ailments such as heart attacks and accidents are routinely brought back to life through the marvel of modern medicine. Following resuscitation, many people report fantastic stories of an experience where their consciousness seemingly exited their bodies during a near-death medical event. Many wonder whether a near-death experience could be considered just a dream or hallucination of a dying mind. The short answer is no. Doctors and scientists have proven in many cases the minds of dead persons who subsequently came back to life and reported near-death experiences had no EEG activity that might account for activity from a vivid imagination. Towards this proof, we will consider the story of Dr. George Grigorovich Rodonia, a Soviet dissident who was killed but returned to life after 3 whole days. For obvious reasons, his account is particularly compelling within the field of near-death experiences. And here is a summary of his experience. Before immigrating to the United States from the Soviet Union in 1989, Dr. George Rodonia worked as a research psychiatrist at the University of Moscow. From his work assisting in the publication of Iberia, an underground freedom newspaper in the former Soviet Union, Dr. Rodonia became known as a vocal dissident and was dubiously honored by being placed on the KGB's hit list. In 1974, at the age of 18, life became even more complicated for Dr. Rodonia when he was invited to pursue advanced research at Yale University in the U.S. Dr. Rodonia was thrilled at the thought of studying at Yale and living in the United States, but since he did not have a wife or family members in the Soviet Union that might discourage him from seeking asylum in the U.S., the Soviet government would not allow him to obtain an exit visa to leave the USSR, even temporarily. By 1976, however, Dr. Rodonia was married and had a son, and the Soviet government grudgingly agreed to allow him to study in the U.S. However, on the day of his scheduled departure for the U.S., the KGB allegedly tried to kill him. While waiting for a taxicab on the sidewalk in Tbilisi, he saw a car jump the curb, drive onto the sidewalk, swerve to avoid a few trees, and head directly towards him. In an instant, Dr. Rodonia was hit head-on at a high rate of speed and flew about 10 yards, landing face down, when the car then ran over him a second time, seemingly to ensure he was actually killed. As a result, Dr. Rodonia suffered broken ribs, torn muscles, mangled feet, and was pronounced dead at the site of the so-called accident. Having been pronounced dead at the scene, there was no need to take Dr. Rodonia to a hospital, so he was instead deposited in a Tbilisi morgue, where his body remained for 3 days. The morgues in Tbilisi are not like those in the U.S. There, bodies are quick frozen immediately and kept in that state for 3 days before an autopsy is performed, where the body is otherwise dispensed for burial or cremation. Dr. Rodonia's body was stone cold dead and frozen for 3 days as it lay in the morgue in Tbilisi, Georgia, USSR. Now, to Dr. Rodonia's sense of self, however, there was never any loss of consciousness. He experienced one of the most extensive and convincing near-death experiences ever recorded, if based on no further input than the fact that he was clinically dead and his body was frozen in a morgue for 3 days, during which his near-death experience occurred. The first thing Dr. Rodoni could recall about his near-death experience, which began immediately after the impact with the car, was that he discovered himself in a realm of total darkness. He had no physical pain and was still aware of his existence as George, but he did not understand where he was or why. The darkness that surrounded him was utter and complete darkness, the greatest darkness he could ever imagine. Darker than dark, blacker than black, the darkness seemed to press upon him as a physical entity, and the experience terrified him. He was shocked to find that he still existed and realized that he should be dead following his car crash, but his current state confused him. The one thought that kept rolling through his mind was, how can I be conscious when I know I am not? The conundrum troubled him. Slowly he got a grip on himself and he began to think about what had just happened in order to try to figure out what was going on. The exercise, however, resulted in no beneficial conclusions. He could not understand why he was in darkness and could not figure what he should do to rectify the situation. And then he remembered René Descartes' famous line, Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And that realization relieved him of a huge burden, for it was then that he knew for certain he was still alive, although inexplicably located in a very different dimension of reality. Interestingly, he pondered if he could continue to exist, that should be just cause for a positive outlook on the situation, especially since he, like most Soviet citizens, was an atheist. An atheist did not believe in an afterlife. He would be happy merely with the comfort that his conscious awareness continued to exist. And expanding that thought, he wondered what could be positive in darkness. And the answer was immediate and obvious. Light, of course. Light would be a positive turn for his experience. Immediately, with that thought of light, there was light, and Dr. Rodania was in the light. The light was bright white, shiny and strong, exceptionally bright. At first the brilliance of the light was almost painful and he could not look at it directly. However, little by little he began to relax. Within the light he realized that he felt warm and comforted, and all of a sudden everything seemed to be okay. Any concern he previously had for his missing body melted away, because it was clear to him at that point that he did not need his body anymore. His human body was suddenly seen as a limitation of his one true self. And once Dr. Rodania was in the light, he gained the impression that the sequence of events in his experience merged together, as if time as he had known it had suddenly come to a halt. The past, present, and future were inexplicably fused together in a timeless unity of now. Dr. Rodania recalled experiencing a life review process, during which he saw his life from beginning to end, complete and in perfect detail, though the entire sequence was relived in an instant. He participated once again in the real-life dramas of his past life, almost like they were holographic images in which he was immersed. During the review, he did not experience any sense of guilt or remorse for things he had done, and neither did he feel concern about his faults or joy about his achievements. Rather, his life had simply been an experience for what it was, and he was content with that. He accepted his past life for the important experience that it was. Throughout this entire period, the light radiated a sense of peace and joy to Dr. Rodania, and he was happy to be in the light. And suddenly he understood what the light meant and what it was. He learned that all the physical rules of human life were nothing when compared to the unified reality of the light. He also came to see impressions of darkness were just another aspect of the infinity that is the light. He realized this reality was everywhere. The light was everywhere. The light was an integral component, part not only of earthly life, but also of the infinite life. Because of the light, everything was not only connected, everything was also one. Dr. Rodania felt a perfect connection to and wholeness within the light, a sense that all was right with himself and the universe. All was as it was meant to be. After 3 days in the morgue, Dr. Rodonia's body was removed from the freezer vault and wheeled to an autopsy room. A team of doctors then commenced splitting apart his lower torso. As the blade cut through flesh, Dr. Rodonia amazingly and spontaneously came back to life, felt the pain of the incision, and opened his eyes. One doctor, thinking this a mere reflex, closed Dr. Rodonia's eyes, but he promptly opened them again. Again the doctor closed his eyes, and once more Dr. Rodonia's eyes popped open, only this time the doctor jumped backward and screamed in shock. Dr. Rodonia's body was cold from being dead and frozen in the morgue for 3 days, and he began to shiver violently. The team of doctors immediately stopped the autopsy, and took Dr. Rodonia to the hospital, where he remained in intensive and rehabilitative care for the next 9 months. Like many who have had a near-death experience, Dr. Rodonia was radically transformed by the experience. Prior to his near-death experience, Dr. Rodonia worked as a neuropathologist and was an avowed atheist. After the experience, he devoted his life to the study of the psychology of religion and eventually obtained a second PhD in the subject. He also became an ordained priest in the Eastern Orthodox Church and later served as an associate pastor at a Methodist church in Texas, where he immigrated to in 1989. Dr. George Rodonia passed away in 2004. Near-death experiences similar to Dr. Rodonia's were made famous through the extensive work and publishing efforts of Dr. Raymond Moody, who published his famous book Life After Life in 1975. Dr. Moody found that there were at least 9 and as many as 15 typical traits of near-death experiences. Despite many striking similarities among various near-death experience accounts, no two accounts are ever identical. Further, the order in which the separated conscious may experience the various stages or traits of a near-death experience varies and are not stuck to a hard and fast model. Dr. Moody found there was no one element of the composite near-death experience that every single person reported. However, a few of the elements of near-death experiences come fairly close to being universal experiences. Extremely few persons experience all the common near-death experience traits, and even persons who have had more than one near-death experience in their lifetime may experience different traits in each of their subsequent near-death experiences. Again, no two near-death experiences are ever exactly the same. Dr. Moody hypothesized the number of traits experienced and the depth of the near-death experience itself may be connected to the manner in which death occurred and the amount of time a person was considered clinically deceased. Generally, persons who experienced death for longer periods of time had more developed experiences, including more traits of the common near-death experience model, than did those persons who were merely on the verge of death and were quickly resuscitated. The composite model of near-death experience traits would typically include the following. First, a sense of being dead. This may include seeing one's dead physical body, remembering the event that caused one's death, or simply realizing your consciousness was no longer in a physical body or a physical state of reality. The second, a feeling of peace, calm, and painlessness. The process of physical death often includes abrupt physical pain, so the sudden absence of that pain may come as a shock, or feelings of peace, calm, and painlessness suddenly fill one's reality and focused attention, given their prior expectation for continued physical pain. Third, an out-of-body experience. A consciousness that leaves this physical body may still have occasion to witness physical reality for a brief time in the region near where the human body remains. This experience can add much for proving the validity of near-death experiences, especially when a person is later resuscitated and is able to describe physical events, persons, or items used near the proximity of their deceased body for which they should not otherwise have been aware during the time that they were dead. Fourth, a tunnel experience. Many near-death experiencers describe being sucked into a dark tunnel shortly after exiting their physical body, and then sense rapid movement towards a bright light at the end of the tunnel. And fifth, rising rapidly into the heavens. Once the consciousness has left the physical body, it's rarely allowed to remain long in or near the physical realm. In the absence of a tunnel experience, the consciousness would likely feel it is rapidly ascending above the earth and into the heavens, where it soon enters the light. Near-death experiencers describe everything in heaven as being composed of light. 6. Seeing people of light. Once in the light, the recently deceased consciousness may see other people in the light. Descriptions of these people attest to them being composed entirely of light. Oftentimes, those people are deceased loved ones and friends who are greeting them upon entry into the light. Sometimes spirit guides will assist the recently deceased consciousness to find the tunnel or light and encourage them to move towards and enter the light. 7th, a supreme being of light is often described as an entity far above, meaning wiser, more loving, and powerful than one's friends and family members who are gathered to greet the recently deceased upon entry into the light. The supreme being of light is always reported to emanate love and make the newly deceased consciousness feel welcome and secure. The supreme being of light may lead a life review and is often attributed as the force that insists on the spirit's return to the physical body because their time has not yet come. 8th, a life review is always described as having occurred in a manner outside of the normal concepts of time. If a person experiences a life review, his or her life events are witnessed in toto, meaning in full all at once, while a guide or the supreme being of light discusses each of the events with an attitude of querying what knowledge was gained. or what benefit was attained by the experience as a consequence of the person's actions. Further, life events are re-experienced as if the soul was living them again, but not only from a first-person perspective, but also from the perspective of everyone touched by the event. If one caused pain, that pain is also experienced from the other person's point of view. The near-death experiencer thus understands the emotional and wider-ranging impact of their humanly actions on Earth. Amazingly, near-death experiencers report there is no external judgment or condemnation during this life review process. Any judgments of right or wrong for any individual action is applied only by one's own self during the life review. The guide or supreme being of light often acts as an intermediary so that one does not place too much negative self-judgment on the actions conducted during life, but rather encourages the soul to learn from the experience, a tacit imploration to improve and make better decisions upon his or her return to physical life. And ninth, altered concepts of space and time. Space and time seem to function differently when one is in a physical body. Generally, time in the non-physical realm is described as being an infinite state of now, with no past, present, or future differentiation. Spatial relations are likewise different in that travel across seemingly infinite space can be instantaneous, and yet there are sometimes impressions that even space does not exist when there is only a unity. The latter concept is extremely hard for humans to consider to be valid, but in a non-physical reality where nothing exists but consciousness, and consciousness creates the reality it desires to experience, space and spatial separation or distances are merely theoretical constructs that exist in one's imagination for the benefit of consciousness and the experiences that consciousness desires to create for itself. 10th, the complete knowledge of reality. Near-death experiencers often describe their experience in the non-physical realm as being more real than even physical reality. Their senses tend to be heightened, and experiences are not only instantaneous but completely transparent and fully understood. It is as if the veil of amnesia is suddenly lifted from the consciousness, and the spirit suddenly understands the meaning and purpose of life. The fact that one can experience a high level of consciousness while physically unconscious or clinically dead is medically inexplicable. Further, the near-death experiencer understands their connection to everything around them, and a seeming flood of information about life and the nature of the universe suddenly becomes available and completely clear to them. Thoughts become clear and incredibly rapid, and communications between the soul and other entities is instantaneous form of telepathy. 11th, being one with reality. Near-death experiencers may experience infinite connections with everyone and everything around them, and that experience often has a very tangible effect on their behaviors upon return to their life in the physical world. This is especially so when coupled with the effects of learning the tangible impacts and consequences of their own actions on others, and having experienced self-judgment of those actions during their life review. As such, returning near-death experiencers may feel one of the most important commandments for fulfilling life on earth is to love everyone and everything around them, and to be non-judgmental of other people's actions. And 12th, a reluctance to return. The experience of heaven is euphoria. Near-death experiencers uniformly characterize their experiences as indescribable. It's hardly surprising that once a near-death experience must be concluded, the consciousness is reluctant to leave heaven and must be forcibly returned to the body, even though the spirit may plead to remain or resist the need to return. Upon return, one's conscious self is often described as feeling a need to shrink or somehow squeeze to fit back into the physical body. The physical body is also characterized upon return as a restrictive coat of dense, heavy energy. Quite a shocking change from being a free-floating, light-based energy form. And 13th, disappointment at being revived. There can be unpleasant feelings, including loneliness and depression, even anger or tears, at the realization they are now back in their physical bodies and no longer in the utopia of heaven experienced on the other side. There are many more potential traits of near-death experiences not included here because not every trait is universally perceived and not every person is equally impacted by each particular trait. This may limit spontaneous recall of certain traits, and lacking foreknowledge of a potential trait, an interviewer might not specifically query every possible trait's presence within the near-death experience. For example, one near-death experiencer related there was a problem trying to express what had happened during the near-death experience. The human vocabulary is based on words needed to describe three-dimensional life experiences, but life in the non-physical realm of the afterlife is distinctly multidimensional. As such, the reporter did not have an adequate vocabulary or means to relate the experience. Returning to the near-death experience related by Dr. Redonia, despite the fact that he had an exceptional near-death experience that lasted 3 days in human physical terms, even he did not experience all of the so-called common near-death experience traits listed here. This simply reinforces Dr. Moody's conclusion that everyone's near-death experience is unique to his or her own circumstances. The absence of any near-death experience trait does not reflect or deflect from the potential validity of their experience. And further, no near-death experience trait could be required to occur for researchers to positively identify whether or not a near-death experience actually occurred. Dr. Jeffrey Long provided compelling evidence that near-death experience cannot be reduced to overactive brain activity at the moment of death. Dr. Long provided the following arguments to support a conclusion that the human consciousness does not expire at death. First, there are consistent near-death experience traits. Elemental traits in near-death experiences are generally consistent in all age groups, religions, and ethnicities around the world. They are also irrespective of gender, social class, educational level, or marital status. This fact refutes the possibility that near-death experiences have any relation to dreams or hallucinations, which are never universally congruent. Near-death experiences from non-Western countries are also incredibly similar to those that occur to people in Western countries. That is, near-death experience traits may be similar, but their interpretations allow for cultural and religious differences. Christians may experience the supreme being of light to be Jesus, while Muslims might interpret the being to be Muhammad, and spiritualists may consider the being to be a high-level spirit guide. Within these cultural filters, there is no right or wrong perception. That which is presented to the departed consciousness is that which the consciousness is ready and prepared to experience. And so it makes sense that a Christian might believe the loving supreme being of light to be Jesus, and the belief and interpretation of the experience is neither right nor wrong. It is simply culturally appropriate according to one's preconceived expectations. Second, there are realistic out-of-body experiences. Out-of-body experiences are one of the most common elements of near-death experiences. What near-death experiences report seeing and hearing in physical, earthly events in the out-of-body state is almost always realistic. When a near-death experiencer or others later seek to verify what the near-death experiencer observed or heard during the out-of-body experience, the observations are generally confirmed as accurate. Even if the observations during a near-death experience included events that occurred far from the physical body's location on Earth, and thus far from any possible sensory awareness of the near-death experiencer, the out-of-body observations are still almost always confirmed as accurate. This fact alone rules out the possibility that near-death experiences are related to any known brain functioning or sensory awareness. This also refutes the possibility that near-death experiences are unrealistic fragments of imagination or memory from the brain. Third, heightened senses. Not only are heightened senses reported by most who have experienced near-death experiences, but also normal or supernormal panoramic vision has occurred in those with significantly impaired vision, including the blind. Several people who have been totally blind since birth have reported highly visual near-death experiences, which is not explainable from an overactive imagination, because those who are blind, born blind, cannot even imagine what it means to see light or colors. In many cases, adventitiously blind near-death experiencers have described medical equipment being used on their deceased bodies that was not even invented before they became blind, and thus could not have been imagined or otherwise described accurately if the items were not somehow observed visually during the out-of-body experience, and this is medically inexplicable. Fourth, being fully conscious during general anesthesia. Many near-death experiences occur while a person is under general anesthesia, a time when any conscious experience should be impossible. While some skeptics claim that these near-death experiences may be the result of too little anesthesia, this ignores the fact that some near-death experiences result from anesthesia overdose. Additionally, the description of a near-death experience differs greatly from those of one who experiences anesthetic awareness. The content of near-death experiences that occur under general anesthesia is essentially indistinguishable from near-death experiences that did not occur under general anesthesia, and this is strong evidence that near-death experiences are occurring independently of the functioning of the physical brain. Fifth, perfect playback. Life reviews and near-death experiences include real events that previously took place in the lives of those having the experience, even if the events were forgotten or happened before the person was old enough to remember. While such memories can be dredged from the subconscious through such means as hypnosis. This does not explain how having a near-death experience could somehow cause one to experience the emotions, feelings, and effects of their actions on persons around them, as is always reported of those experiencing a near-death life review during the experience. 6. Family reunions. During a near-death experience, the personalities encountered are virtually always deceased, and sometimes they even are relatives who died before the near-death experiencer was even born. Were the near-death experience only a product of memory fragments, they would almost certainly include far more living people, including those with whom they have more recently interacted, and thus were a more prominent part of their near-term life experiences, and not those that they barely knew or perhaps had never even met. And 7th, near-death experiences of children, including very young children who are too young to have developed their own concepts of death, religion, or near-death experiences, are essentially identical to those of adults. And this refutes the possibility that pre-existing beliefs or cultural conditioning produces the content of near-death experiences. 8th, it is common for people to experience major life changes after having a near-death experience. These after effects are often powerful, lasting, and life-enhancing. The changes also generally follow a consistent pattern, as the near-death experiencers themselves almost always believe that the near-death experiences were real, and lessons learned must be incorporated into their lives during their second chance at life upon return. Near-death experiences of the congenitally or adventitiously blind are particularly important to the scientific study of the field of near-death experiences. The blind's description of experiences, especially visual experiences during a near-death experience, lend particular credence to the validity of the near-death experience phenomenon. For one reason, persons born blind do not experience visual dreams because they have no concept of light, colors, or visual images. Additionally, children who lose their sight before age 7 also do not generally retain visual imagery in their dreams. Dreams of the blind, even the adventitiously blind, thus tend to emphasize their other physical senses for which they can readily relate, such as hearing, touch, taste, and smell. When they suddenly experience sight during a near-death experience, including colors, light, and visual impressions of their surroundings, it is often the first such experience of their lives, and is thus particularly remarkable to them and is inexplicable to medical researchers. What follows are two very brief summaries of anecdotal accounts of near-death experiences for two separate blind experiencers, originally reported by Dr. Kenneth Ring in his groundbreaking book, Mindsight. These accounts may serve as scene setters for the validity of near-death experiences of the blind. Vicky Umapeg experienced two separate near-death experiences approximately a decade apart. She was born blind and as such could not even understand or comprehend a description of or the nature of light. During her first near-death experience, she found herself out of her body and able to see her surroundings for the first time in her life. During both near-death experiences, she perceived her own non-physical body or soul to have a distinct form which seemed to be made of light. Vicky experienced multiple standard near-death experience traits, the most personally surprising of which was crystal clear visual perception. Vicky experienced her death and out-of-body experience, including witnessing her deceased body. Shortly thereafter, Vicky felt pulled into a tunnel, and when she emerged, she was in a place of incredible light. Vicky noted the brightness of the light was not unpleasant, rather it was incredibly warm, beautiful, and intense. Vicky described the light was more than what humans typically consider light to be. The light could be seen as well as felt. Additionally, the light conveyed information and feelings, words, music, and energy, but mostly love. Further, the light came from everywhere, and so love was everywhere. It seemed as if love came from the grass, and love came from the birds, and every other conceivable location and entity that was light within the realm of light. Brad Barrows had many similar descriptions of the light from his near-death experience. Brad Barrows was also blind from birth, but he was able to see for the first time during his near-death experience. He described the light of heaven as seemingly all-encompassing. The light seemed to comprise everything therein. The grass and trees were somehow made of light, and everything was both bright and colorful and yet translucent. Buildings were also made of light. Though they gave off light, the light could penetrate everything as well, and so Brad could see through the buildings. Brad saw there was no shade under the trees, but neither was there need for shade. As previously noted, everyone has a different experience within their near-death experience. possibly because their attention is drawn towards that which is most amazing to them during the unusual event. For Brad Barrows, this was the feeling of peace he experienced during a near-death experience. He felt heaven was so unbelievably peaceful, it would be impossible to describe the peace, calm, and tranquility he found in the light. Of course, not everyone who is blind and experiences a near-death or out-of-body experience reports being able to see during their experience. There are many reasons that could account for this discrepancy. First, Dr. Ring noted it was not clear whether the respondents who were blind from birth and claimed not to have seen were actually unable to see, or simply they failed to recognize what seeing was. For people who have never known what it means to see, they've become so accustomed to living without the aid of sight that they do not feel encumbered without the ability. By extension, moving about as a free spirit with clarity of senses may thus seem to them that their other senses, and possibly even the concept of total knowledge, may have made up for what they presume to be a continuation of their lack of sight. And second, some reporters of their near-death experience note that sight, communication, and other physical human concepts do not operate with a large degree of equivalence in the spirit world. Sight, for example, is often described not as sight, but as total awareness, including awareness of one's surroundings. The spirit is in a state of all-knowing, though this phenomenon is not necessarily via direct visual perception. Further, other near-death experience accounts provide the human body's concept of sight in an almost 180-degree field of view is exceeded in the non-physical realm to perfect panoramic, 360-degree, and even spherical vision. This has significant overlap with the concept of total awareness, and thus is not necessarily surprising that some blind near-death experiencers do not realize they are seeing because the awareness that they are experiencing in the out-of-body state matches no concept of physical sight familiar to humans. Not all cases can be explained, however. One blind woman reported not having visual perception in her near-death experience, but did claim visual perception during multiple out-of-body experiences that were not otherwise associated with death. Recalls Will that upon first realizing he was dead and no longer in his physical body, Dr. George Rodonia felt surrounded by absolute darkness. This did not change until he asserted to himself that he should be in and experience light in order to be happy. The simple act of asserting clarity of thought concerning his need for light created the experience of light that Dr. Rodonia had intended. And thus blind near-death experiencers who did not experience light during their event almost assuredly had that kind of experience because they did not realize they were living without any crucial sensory input for which they were accustomed. Without a perceived need, there was no reason to seek the light, ask for light, or even consider a need for light, and thus they experienced sensory input that was closer to their preconceived notions of what was right, and not necessarily what was possible or available to them. In general, Dr. Ring noted blind people report experiences that conform to the prototype near-death experience model developed and outlined by Dr. Raymond Moody, which again adds further validity to the research results concerning near-death experiences. Certainly, there are opponents to the validity of the near-death experience. English parapsychologist Susan Blackmore is a chief proponent of the retrospective reconstruction hypothesis, which contends that from a combination of prior experiences or expectations, overheard conversations, or other sensory cues, plus information gleaned afterward or even simply by lucky guesses, it might be possible for a near-death experiencer to imaginatively reconstruct a pictorial representation of events that occurred during a near-death experience. However, this idea has no support among those who actually experienced a near-death experience, and is limited in its inability to account for instances where unusual objects can be described by those who are both unconscious and physically handicapped, whether deaf, blind, or otherwise, thus limiting opportunities to obtain such second-hand information. The retrospective reconstruction hypothesis is also unable to account for the clarity and universal commonality of the otherworldly segment descriptions common to near-death experiences. Verifiable out-of-body experiences that occur during a near-death experience lend some credence to the validity of the near-death experience. These are often descriptions of the resuscitation process, or identifying physical items present in the room where the resuscitation process occurred. There is generally no explanation that could satisfactorily explain a near-death experiencer's knowledge of these observations made while they were unconscious or dead, except that a person's consciousness was somehow out of his or her body at the time. People whose bodies have recently expired and are in the process of being resuscitated may find themselves in the out-of-body state and from a vantage point in the near proximity of the resuscitation process that affords them the ability to observe and later describe the equipment, procedures, surroundings, and personnel working on their physical body. If the person being resuscitated has the added physical trait of being deaf, blind, or even dead, then his claim of witnessing, seeing, or hearing things that would have been impossible from the physical body's own vantage point tends to add particular credibility to his first-hand account. These types of incidents where people are seemingly out of their bodies during near-death experiences and observe events that can be verified upon their return to a conscious state are known as veridical near-death experiences. Thankfully, research case histories of near-death experiences are full of such accounts. The following are just a few case examples of veridical evidence. A Dutch nurse reported a 44-year-old cyanotic comatose man was delivered to her coronary unit by ambulance one evening. When the staff tried to intubate the man, they initially had difficulties because he used dentures. The nurse removed the patient's upper dentures and placed them on a nearby crash cart. A week later, the same nurse met the patient again during routine rounds to distribute medication. The moment the patient saw the nurse, he claimed to those with him that she knew where his dentures were. The nurse was surprised by this declaration because she could not recall why the patient would think that she would know this information. The patient explained he remembered watching his body being brought into the hospital, and he further watched the staff perform CPR to resuscitate him. The patient noted the nurse removed his dentures from his mouth during this process and put them on a cart, which he described as having many bottles on top and a sliding drawer underneath. The nurse was intrigued by the story and upon further inquiry, quickly learned the man claimed also to have observed himself from a point above his physical body, where he was able to see his own body lying on the bed while the staff worked to revive it. The patient even described correctly and in detail the room in which he had been resuscitated, as well as provided descriptions of those persons who had been present. The patient added the experience caused him to no longer fear death, and following the patient's description, nor shortly located the man's dentures. In 1977, Maria, a migrant worker, was taken to Harborview Hospital in Seattle, Washington in an unconscious state after suffering a cardiac arrest. A social worker visited her the following day in her hospital room, at which point Maria described leaving her body after admission to the emergency room and floating above the hospital on her way to heaven. Desperate to prove that she was not delusional, Maria described seeing a worn blue tennis shoe on the ledge outside a window on the far side of the hospital. Though the social worker did not believe Maria's story, she wanted to help and so went room to room, checking the ledges from each by pressing her face against the sealed windows. The social worker eventually found a shoe that perfectly matched the details Maria had related. The vantage point on the ledge was such that it would have been impossible for Maria to have seen the shoe either from ground level outside the hospital or from where she had been at any point in time while inside the hospital. The social worker could not explain how Maria could have observed that dark blue shoe through any normal means. Further evidencing the unique power of near-death experiences is the transformative properties of the experience on people who return from death. The transformative property of the experience is nearly universal, attesting to the intense influence the experiences carry over to the person's continuing life in the physical world. After effects cannot be faked. They affect not only the near-death experiencer, but by connection everyone in the experiencer's life as well. Around 80% of the people who have had near-death experiences noted that their lives were forever changed by what happened to them. Near-death experiencers do not return with just a renewed zest for life and a more spiritual outlook. They also tend to experience specific, often drastic psychological and physiological differences on a dramatic scale, and these changes are enduring, usually affecting near-death experiencer for the remainder of his or her life. Further, this is true whether a near-death experience occurred as a child or as an adult. Whether their near-death experience was beautiful or terrifying, near-death experiencers commonly report the experience was unlike a dream, more real than real, clearly the most powerful event in their entire lives. The after effects are one testament to the validity of the experience, given the wide-ranging occurrence of these after effects across cultures and age groups, and again, the fact that these after effects cannot be faked. Near-death experiencers may struggle to find words to describe their near-death experience, but insist they now know something new about reality, that there is more to reality than what is here in the physical world. As such, most are deeply changed in their attitudes towards life, work, religion, and interpersonal relationships. In several studies, nearly all near-death experiencers reported a strong decrease or even complete loss of fear of death as a result of their near-death experiences. They had experienced what happens after death on the other side, and they now knew their conscious self would not end with physical death. Many experiencers also noted there was not a single moment of loss of consciousness at the point of bodily expiration. Their spirit simply moved from a physical to a non-physical state, but their personality, awareness, and consciousness all remained intact and fully alert at all times. At least 98% of those surveyed near-death experiencers came to believe that there is life after death following their experiences. From their experience, over 80% of near-death experiencers also learned that life has a meaning or purpose, and that revelation directly affected the way they conducted their lives ever after upon return. The average near-death experiencer also came to regard himself or herself as an immortal soul who currently resides in a physical form, so that lessons could be learned while he or she experienced life on Earth. After the near-death experience, they knew they were not just their body, and they no longer needed to identify themselves with their human body. Their body came to be viewed simply as a vessel that allowed them to complete their work in this life to gain important life lessons for specific purposes that had been arranged prior to this incarnation. Indeed, many go on after their near-death experience to embrace the theory of reincarnation. Eventually, the returning near-death experiencer will assimilate those experiences and lessons into their physical life and consider their present life and body to be important and special again. During the near-death experience, experiencers are usually struck by the cosmic importance placed on love thy neighbor, finding that we are all connected. Indeed, everything in the universe is connected. And because of these experiences, learn the most important thing in life is to love everyone around them unconditionally and without judgment. As such, near-death experiencers come to love and accept others without the usual attachments and conditions that society expects. Instead of judging, criticizing, and condemning, they perceive themselves as equally and fully loving of each and all, openly generous and excited about the potential and wonder of each person they see. Their desire is to fulfill a prime directive during the near-death experience, to be the conduit of universal love. Confused family members tend to regard the sudden change of behavior as oddly threatening, as if their loved one has become aloof, unresponsive, and even uncaring or unloving to them in particular. A sad paradox from this experience is that to love one's enemies unconditionally seems cold and callous towards the feelings of one's closest friends and family, and especially when they have personally suffered an injury at the hands of others. In this case, the near-death experiencer seemingly fails to perform a duty expected of society, which is to protect, lash out, or connect emotionally with the loved one's injury or sense of injustice. Spouses may mistake this unconditional way of expressing joy and affection towards persons other than themselves as flirtatious disloyalty, and divorce often results. In one study, 65% of near-death experiencers' marriages ended up in divorce, as opposed to about 50% in the general population. Major changes in values, careers, and religious views also contributed to marital stress in returning near-death experiencers' relationships. Near-death experiences almost always lead to spiritual curiosity. People who are not overtly religious before a near-death experience report that they both believe in God and have an appreciation for spiritualism after their experience. However, they also tend to abandon religious doctrine that is followed solely for the sake of dogma. Near-death experiencers come to realize through their experience that religion is not a matter of one right religious group or belief versus all other wrong groups or beliefs. People who experience a near-death experience often come out of it saying that religion basically concerns one's ability to love others, not doctrines or religious denominations. Experiencers also generally have a profound respect for the attainment of knowledge and learning. They may leave successful businesses and employment for a spontaneous pursuit of new knowledge or life direction. Subsequently, near-life experiencers feel more responsible for the direction they take in their lives. They are also sensitive to how their actions affect and impact others both immediately and in the long term. Hard-driving achievers and materialists can transform overnight into easygoing philosophers, but by the same token, those more relaxed or uncommitted before a near-death experience can become energetic movers and shakers, determined to make a difference in the world in the short time remaining after their return from a near-death experience. Although initially bewildered, family members can be so impressed by what they witness that they too may change, making the experience a shared event. Near-death experiencers often experience problems re-entering and readjusting to the mundane real world. As previously noted, they often have marital difficulties because the spouse feels that he or she is now married to a different person who is much changed from the experience. Most near-death experiencers also develop a sense of timelessness. They tend to flow with the day's events, and display a more heightened awareness of the present moment, claiming an importance of being in the now, making future preparations can seem irrelevant to them. Others often label this behavior spaciness. Near-death experiencers refer to their episode as if it were a type of divider separating their former life from the present. An estimated 89% of near-death experiencers report an increase in intuition, psychic phenomena, or healing abilities following their unique experience, and psychic displays can become commonplace. This behavior may not only be worrisome to relatives and friends, it can be frightening to them as well. A person's religious beliefs pre or post near-death experience do not seem to affect or prevent this amplification of psychic faculties and stimuli. Yet near-death experiencers willing to learn how to control and refine these abilities tend to consider them to be beneficial in the long run. While psychological changes affect near-death experiencers' relationships with others, their post-near-death experience physiological changes affect their relationship with their own body, which generally forces them to accept major lifestyle changes or suffer massive ill effects, including allergic reactions, nausea, and chronic illness. These physical differences eventually lead near-death experiencers to alter their approach to health and healing, employment, finances, and lifestyle issues. Many say that it is almost as if they have to relearn how to use their own body and brain. Near-death experiencers may experience unusual sensitivity to light and sound, which can be a serious issue and may well necessitate some lifestyle changes. While most near-death experiencers must limit sunshine exposure, others may feel that they can't get enough. Almost all near-death experiencers, though, have similar difficulties with loud music or discordant sounds. Many report they can no longer tolerate hard rock music. Instead, the vast majority report a preference for classical, melodic style music and/or natural sounds, and many become passionate about the potential for using music to heal. Most near-death experiencers must change their diet and health practices to accommodate these physiological changes. Near-death experiencers generally exhibit accelerated metabolic and substance absorption rates, along with a decreased tolerance for pharmaceuticals and chemically treated products or food. They often report an imperative command received during their near-death experience to return to the land, interpreted as a need to eat organic food and utilize homeopathic and alternative medical procedures. Failure to follow this injunction may lead to increased allergies or food sensitivities and nausea if one does not accept his or her body's newfound preference for more organic vegetables and grains and less consumption of meat. Other physiological changes include substantially more or less energy, lower blood pressure, electrical sensitivity, and altered thought processing. Interestingly, most of the physiological effects can be physically measured and are quite noticeable to both the near-death experiencer and the people with whom they routinely interacted before and after the near-death experience. Not all people who experience a near-death experience feel comfortable discussing this experience with others, and many takes years to fully assimilate and understand their near-death experience. However, whether the experience is discussed or even understood, these after effects are an immediate component of the near-death experiencer's lives for which they will have to deal for the rest of their lives. Some components of the composite near-death experience model have obvious similarities to many scientific findings of quantum physics. In particular, this includes the light phenomenon, being one with reality, and altered concepts of time and space. In the last video chapter, we discussed some of the implications of Einstein's famous equation E equals mc squared. Einstein's equation shows the direct proportionality between mass and energy. As one increases, so too must the other, and thus mass and energy are directly related to one another. We also discussed Max Planck's finding known as Planck's constant, which equated each photon of light with a specific matter of energy, and in other words, light and energy are also directly related to one another. Thus, we return to the conclusion reached through the mathematical transitive property that all matter is not only stabilized energy, but more simply, matter is a mass of stabilized light. This scientific conclusion matches very well with anecdotal observations made by millions of near-death experiencers during their brief sojourns into heaven. Everything the near-death experiencers observed while in the non-physical dimension is seemingly made of light. Indeed, the substance of the universe, of all the seen and unseen, is reportedly composed of light. They learned that atoms and matter in the physical realm, described as the lowest level of energy, is merely dense light, stabilized at a very low frequency. A unique extension of the light phenomenon observed by near-death experiencers is that light itself is conscious. Put another way, the light is the consciousness of the universe, and the consciousness is the light. Even more so, the near-death experiencers experience that all the light of the universe, that is, all of the consciousness of the universe, is connected and really one and the same entity. And this leads in well with the next near-death experience trait, being one with reality. Dr. J.S. Bell proved mathematically that everything in the universe is connected at the subatomic level. A simple extension of this mathematical finding, known as Bell's theorem, is that everything in the universe is simply a part of, an extension of, or a manifestation of that one entity. This idea corresponds well with the knowledge gained by near-death experiencers during their near-death experience. Near-death experiencers report a literal connection to everything around them and learn there is a reason why humans are implored to love one another and to love thy neighbor as their self. Their neighbor literally is their self, simply a different manifestation of that unity. This leads to an interesting conundrum. Human consciousness, through the psychological ego, experiences life as an independent entity, not as part of a collective consciousness, and yet humanity is expected to trust in this assertion as fact, as part of their evolutionary and educational process in life. It should come as no surprise then that this information is difficult to conceive or implement, and the effects of its assimilation lead to the drastic after effects of the near-death experience previously described. Humans cannot normally live by this spiritual commandment without drastically changing in ways that stand out at odds with society or the loved ones in their life. This is not to say that the challenge is impossible, but merely at odds with current society, and thus not an easy task to undertake. Altered concepts of space and time is another idea that is very difficult for humans to accept as valid, but has been both proven mathematically through the efforts of many renowned physicists and experienced as truth by near-death experiencers. The difficulty in acceptance is that humans live in a three-dimensional world that experiences change with time, and the altered concept of time and space insists on a four-dimensional reality referred to by physicists as space-time, where the past, present, and future all meet in a singularity, a point in space-time referred to as now. These two near-death experience traits coalesce within a life review. In regards to the altered concept of space and time, near-death experiencers report the life review as instantaneous despite the fact that every intimate detail of a person's life is reviewed in toto to help the soul gain a deeper level of understanding of the events from her life. Imagine reliving an entire lifetime in an instant without losing any of the detail or emotions, on top of engaging in an academic discussion on each life event to determine the lessons learned therein. This is the implication of the life review. In regards to being one with reality, life reviews are remarkable in that the conscious experiences full, omniscient knowledge of the consequences and repercussions of their actions on others in that life. They not only relive life events from a first-person perspective, they also feel and understand how their actions affected others from their alternate point of view. Researchers Ring and Cooper noted that the emphasis in life review was generally focused on feelings and emotions, as well as how one's motives played into their actions. Anger and self-defense are quite justifiable, for example, but deliberate cruelty would be frowned upon. This idea corresponds well with the previous imperative to love one's neighbors as oneself. If the most important commandment of life is to love others unconditionally, then it stands to reason that a life review would be the most rewarding when one's effects on others had been loving, helpful, and positive. And still, as previously seen, the after effects of near-death experiences are not always positive on the near-death experiencer's own marital relationships, given their higher precedence of divorce. Thus, one might conclude the viability of the commandment to love one's neighbors as oneself without causing undue pain to one's family and friends in the process can only be accomplished when society as a whole advances to a point where such unconditional love can be understood without damaging intimate interpersonal relationships. If you would like to explore further the scientific findings of near-death experiences discussed in Hidden Truth, I invite you to download a free copy of the first half of my book from my blog site located at the following URL. And we'll continue this video series with a continued discussion on evidence available through out-of-body experiences. I look forward to seeing you there shortly.